Welcome to Elite Politics. On our new channel, we continue the series analyzing the current situation of the Chinese Communist Party's internal affairs. This old man is either the oldest puppet of the Chinese Communist Party, or he's openly declaring the final war on Xi Jinping. This is Wen Jiabao. He is playing a game of chess with Xi Jinping as we speak, and former premier of China until 2013. Here's the things that people, mostly might not understand is that in China, under the CCP, the life of a premier in the party, it doesn't really end well, or at least not the recent ones. Just look at the pattern. Li Qiang, the current premier, title only, no real power. And Li Keqiang, the one before him, different people, his predecessor, suddenly dead, heart attack, and we still haven't gotten a real solid answer as to how he died. The role itself has been hollowed out, but when Wen Jiabao was the premier before he retired or stepped out in 2013, he is somebody who had real power. And right now, he's the kingpiece opposite of Xi Jinping for many reasons. Now, I've long talked about this elder faction going against Xi, and right now, Wen Jiabao is the leader of that. Now, he's currently the oldest and still functional member. Others who have slightly more seniority don't really have the health or I would say the vitality to even come out, but he's relatively healthy. And as the former number 2 leader that's still alive, he still has some level of political influence, or I guess concrete, practical ability to carry that out, right? Again, tying to the health. But he came from sort of the last era before power was concentrated fully onto one guy. And that was an era where you had factions balancing each other out. You had this so-called collective leadership, and you still had a system where there's internal negotiations and people kind of made decisions without just a single person saying yes or no. Obviously, fast forward to today, Wen is no longer in power, but because he's part of this sort of the paramount power once before, he becomes what's called an elder. And so there's many of people like him who belong to the circle of elders. And in politics, in the CCP aspect at least, it doesn't mean you're irrelevant, that you were just a respected old person. It actually means you have a network of people that are still connected to you. It means with history comes influence, which doesn't show up on paper at least, right? But it's more nuanced. And so more importantly than anything else, it's actually about the current faction war. The Xi faction versus the anti-Xi faction. Now, I've been covering this for a while. Since the summer of 2024, Xi's power has been shaken. He likely suffered a stroke during the third plenum meeting that summer, which gave the window of opportunity for these elders to reclaim some power. Now, over the last decade, Xi Jinping didn't just govern, right? He rewrote the structure of power within the party. He effectively got rid of factional balance as a part of that negotiation. Inside the CCP, he centralized everything around himself. So when he faints or something happens to him, no one else has a real decision-making ability or authority. So when the elders realize that this is the moment, right? Because when nobody else can say stuff or do stuff, the elders are the only people who can come in with the authority to say that if anything happens, I'm the one you can come and blame, but because I'm an elder, technically you're not going to drag me to prison, right? So that's kind of where Wen Jiabao sits with some of the other elders still out there. And what they've formed is the current iteration of the anti-Xi Jinping alliance or alignment, right? Now, look at what just happened. So Wen Jiabao walks out publicly. There's no restrictions, there's no concealment, there's no sign of house arrest, which contradicts a rumor that started earlier this year that says because he opposed Xi's Taiwan invasion, him and his family were put on house arrest, they were restricted, carefully surveilled, but he had been politically neutralized, right? Well, one appearance destroyed all of those speculations, and he doesn't just appear anywhere. He went to a very specific location. He went to the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Now, this is not random because this is one of the most important state institutions in China. This is where a lot of the technology, policy, directions, the future, so to speak, of the CCP, the planning aspect at least, comes from. So it's also heavily tied to his own political and education career. So you don't just randomly walk to a place like this with guards and everything else and do a photo op. You show up there to signal some sort of irrelevance to the current situation. And this time, it's a signal of return. The reason why I say that is because as we speak now, Xi Jinping has regained control since 2024. He did so earlier this year when the vice chairman of the military, Zhang Youxia, was suddenly purged. Shocking to many people, including myself, this was a turning point in the 2 years sort of battle over who actually controls power. And because these elders came from an era of so-called collective leadership, that's their weakness, right? They don't have the resolve to remove Xi Jinping when they had the chance. So when you leave somebody as calculated in terms of power struggles as Xi Jinping is, that always leaves the room for him to bounce back. And so he did. And now, when it comes to what's the current situation? Well, it's kind of complicated in the sense that I think both sides, the Xi faction and the anti-Xi faction, has suffered a tremendous amount of casualties. And both sides are sustaining a lot of damage. But let me just talk to you in sort of a chessboard term. Maybe that will make things a little bit simpler and easier to understand. Okay, so like I mentioned, right, currently the latest is Wen Jiabao's picture, photo op, signals a return from what I think is a temporary battle wound, the loss of Zhang Youxia. So if Xi's control were absolute, someone like Wen, especially with rumors tying him to internal opposition, they shouldn't be allowed to publicly make these photo ops because he can carefully calculate and control every one of them and their movements, right? So just everything that happens around that time, Zhang Youxia, vice chair of the Central Military Commission, suddenly purged, and that's when we realized that Xi and Zhang were not aligned. And so around the same time, some of Xi Jinping's wife's close allies were also picked off one by one. So let's talk in the chess terms. On the chessboard, the latest move is a knight for a rook. Okay, so the knight comes from Xi's side, and the rook is on the anti-Xi side. Last year, I said that Zhang Youxia and the elders, namely Wen Jiabao, were allied together to take down Xi Jinping behind the scenes. But when Zhang was purged, Xi clawed back some of that power, right? Zhang was the rook, and Ma Xingwei, this person, is the knight who was sacrificed from Xi's side of the board. So that's the play, right? It's the knight for a rook. Now, Ma is Xi's wife's top ally. He happened to have a last name with Ma, which literally translates to horse in Chinese. So that's why it's the knight reference. Anyone that plays chess obviously knows that the rook is a much higher value piece than the knight. So losing a rook is, in most circumstances, a terrible thing compared to losing a knight, relatively. But it makes sense to trade one for one in some scenarios or circumstances, right? So because we have to look at the overall board. Last year, Xi Jinping, on this chessboard, already lost both of his rooks, He Weidong and Miao Hua, the second vice chairman and the chief political officer of the military. And that large-scale purge led to Xi Jinping wanting revenge, setting his sights on Zhang Youxia, which is the rook of the enemy, the anti-Xi faction. So as we know now, obviously, that this has been done, Zhang's been purged, so both sides lost their rooks, right? Were there mistakes made by the anti-Xi faction in this chess game? I think so, because for 2 years straight, they had control of the board. They were in control, they were purging all the pieces, and yet they were indecisive in the sense that they didn't want to do the checkmate on Xi Jinping. They underestimated the vulnerability of their own rook in the case that's Zhang Youxia. But again, it was already too late by the time they realized that the knight was coming for the rook, or whoever else was coming. The rook is dead. So they instead go attack the knight on the other side. But obviously, this is not just the knight. As we said, I would assume this is the right side of the chessboard. This is where they threaten the queen, right, who is the wife of Xi Jinping. So you got the right side pawns. They're going after the bishop. They're going after the knight, and they're threatening the queen. So there's a right side focus of attack, which obviously is going to damage Xi's faction. And so some of the associates of Ma Xingwei, they've been questioned, investigated, and taken down. Now, as a king, Xi Jinping hasn't left his squares in recent days, actually. She hasn't left the Beijing area since Zhang Youxia's downfall. He's afraid that they're going to come for him directly. He hasn't done any major foreign travel. He even broke the tradition of, supposedly the CCP leader is supposed to go visit other areas outside of Beijing during Chinese New Year, symbolizing, that the country is doing well, or they're supposed to go and be with the people, in a far area from Beijing, right? So this is not normal behavior for a leader to just stay in Beijing, and this is not normal for somebody who is projecting confidence. He did go as far as Xiong'an, which is a developmental area just south of Beijing, but that's basically the same as moving one square as a king, right? Meanwhile, the king on the other side, Wen Jiabao, just made an illegal move. He moved like 2 to 3 squares. He was copying the moves of a bishop, something like that. Wen was walking freely into a core institution like nothing happened. So the message there is pretty simple. If I had to summarize it again in chess terms, is that the anti-Xi side still has more pieces to play, but they're much more careful now than before because they realize that the surprise attacks from Xi can happen anytime, and their key pieces can still be taken out. And but honestly, I think this is a pretty good summary of the current situation. On the surface, you still have Xi in control, but the anti-Xi faction quietly in the background. And right now, Xi is allowed to move, but he's careful. But the other side is even more careful. I think that's a good summary of that. So, and obviously, the anti-Xi side shows that they're able to move their king, if sometimes even having to make illegal moves. They're still not out of the boundary of the rules of chess completely, right? So looking at the whole board, both sides have suffered bloody losses, but what we're waiting for to happen, I think, is something to flip the entire desk and the entire board goes flying so that the game is over without both sides kind of fighting till the end. Because, yeah, more things are going to come and more pieces will be lost, but in the end, is this just going to come down to two kings trying to go one move at a time with nothing else on board? Who knows? But I think that's the future we're looking at for elite politics. So thank you very much for watching this episode. Hope you enjoyed the content. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And yeah, we'll see you in the next episode to analyze the inside of the CCP.